Good morning, everyone. My name is Cesar Alesi Perez. I'm a research associate with the Higher Education Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you for tuning in for our program today, featuring the findings from our new PPIC report, The Effects of COVID-19 on Transfer Intending Students in California's Community Colleges. Before getting into the report findings, we'd like to first thank our funders, the College Futures Foundation and the Sutton Family Fund, for their support of this research and today's event. And for those of you interested, the report, as well as the slides from today's presentation, a short policy brief, and a very long technical appendices document are available on our website at ppic.org. And one last thing to mention before we begin, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measures or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. Now, shifting our focus back to today's program, I'll first present some key findings from our report, then I'll hand the program over to my colleague and co-author, Jacob Jackson, to moderate a discussion with an esteemed panel of national and state experts in the field about lessons learned from the pandemic and how we can address remaining challenges. And finally, as you just saw, we have some time set aside at the end of the program for audience Q&A. If you have any questions for our speakers about the report or panel discussion, please send an email to the address on the screen at ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And if you decided to do so, we'd appreciate you including your name and the name of your organization along with your question. And with that, I will begin my presentation. Great. Okay, so the report for which this presentation is based is co-authored by myself and my colleagues Jake Jackson, Marisol Cuellar Mejia, Olga Rodriguez, Hans Johnson, and Danielle Payares Montoya. In addition to our funders, my co-authors and I would also like to send a special thank you to our California Community College System partners. This research would not be possible without the student level data provided by the Chancellor's Office. We're also extremely grateful for the valuable insights provided by community college faculty, staff, and administrators during our research interviews. Now, before jumping into our findings, I'll start by providing just a little bit of context on why the effects of the pandemic on transfer intending students specifically has large implications for economic recovery and growth in California. First, California's community college system is the largest in the country, with majority of students coming from low income and historically underrepresented groups, not only making its enrollment reflective of the diversity of the state's population, but making the transfer path a critical access point for many of these students to obtain a bachelor's degree, especially considering that such students are less likely to make it from 9th grade to a college degree compared to their peers. Now, considering the economic benefits of a 4-year degree compared to just a high school or 2-year degree, including higher incomes, higher employment rates, and better outcomes during economic downturns, the system is central in the state's effort to improve economic mobility. And from a broader perspective, about a third of UC and half of CSU undergraduate degrees awarded are to transfer students, making the transfer path essential to meeting the governor's goal to increase degree attainment to 70% by 2030 and to narrow the state's degree gap considering a rising demand for educated workers. Now, one thing to consider is that prior to the pandemic, there were many obstacles already limiting student success on transfer pathways, especially among underrepresented groups. Promisingly, reforms taking place before the spring 2020 term when the pandemic hit, such as AB 705, guided pathways, and associate degree for transfer paths, were beginning to address these issues and help the system meet its 5-year goals set out in its 2017 vision for success, including increasing transfers to UC and CSU and reducing equity gaps. Unfortunately, these positive steps may have been halted by pandemic disruptions, making continued research in this space as important as ever in determining what's working and where more work is needed. We begin to do that with this report using longitudinal student level data to examine the impacts of the pandemic up until the fall 2021 term on the state's transfer intending students, whom we define as those that state a goal to transfer to a 4-year institution in the term of interest. And perhaps to no one's surprise, given the reporting on this over the last few years, our biggest finding is that student counts have declined significantly during the pandemic, exacerbating pre-existing issues with enrollment and persistence that the state's community colleges were already facing prior to the pandemic. Here we see that enrollment declined for students of all academic goals from fall 2019 to fall 2021. Declines were especially steep from 2020 to 2021 among transfer intending students, who account for about 57% of all students. So we'll be looking forward to looking at fall 2022 enrollment to see if this trend has continued another year. The other thing to note here is that enrollment among transfer intending students had already started decreasing in the 2 years before the pandemic, but of course, pandemic declines were unprecedentedly large. We can see these enrollment trends among transfer intending students more clearly here, where we show the percent change in student counts over time. In the first year of the pandemic, we see that enrollment declined more steeply among first-time students, while from 2020 to 2021, declines were larger among continuing students. This likely, at least somewhat, reflects the initial shocks and uncertainties surrounding the pandemic and the shift to online learning, among other disruptions, causing many would-be first-time students to delay or change their enrollment plans, and this leaking over to the next year, which in turn saw less students with one-year experience among continuing students. Now, examining these trends, these declines by race and ethnicity, we find that student counts dropped most among non-white students. Here, the orange bars represent the average percent change in enrollment for each student group in the years prior to the pandemic, proxy for what we might have expected in the absence of COVID-19, while the blue bars represent actual changes from 2019 to 2020, the first year of the pandemic. And the main takeaway here is that the largest declines, as I just mentioned, were among first-time students, but specifically non-white first-time students, especially among Asian, Latino, and Latino students, considering that pre-pandemic, both groups saw increases in enrollment. In fact, first-time enrollment among white students actually declined less steeply than we would have expected in the absence of the pandemic. Now, in our report, we also look at persistence and find that not only were significantly less students showing up, but among those that did initially enroll, many were not successfully completing their courses. Here, we specifically look at whether a student enrolled and successfully completed at least one credit course in one term, 1 year and 2 years out, comparing outcomes between students affected and not affected by the pandemic. So for example, for one-term fall outcomes, shown on the far left, we find that first-time transfer intending students were 6 percentage points less likely to successfully persist, while continuing students were 4 percentage points less likely to do so during the pandemic compared to similar students enrolled prior to the pandemic. And as you can see here, these declines are similar when we look at outcomes 1 and 2 years out. Declines did differ, however, by student group. In this chart, we show that persistence rates declined for all students, but were especially sharp among Latino students. It's also important to consider that persistence rates among Black students were already comparatively low pre-pandemic. So these declines only made those rates lower. In other words, relative to pre-pandemic rates, Latino and Black students saw the largest declines in the probability of successfully completing at least one course in a given term during the pandemic. So taken together, our findings suggest that in light of pandemic disruptions, addressing challenges with enrollment, attrition, and retention should continue to be at the forefront of policy and reform. Now, I should note, however, that such an emphasis should have been and was the case prior to the pandemic, given that these challenges are not new. They're merely magnified by the disruptions brought on by COVID-19. Considering pre-pandemic declines in enrollment among both college age and non-traditional age students, growing net out migration, falling international immigration and birth rates, and continued declines in K-12 enrollment, considering all of these factors, addressing enrollment challenges was always going to be crucial. Furthermore, as corroborated with other national and statewide surveys, our interviews with faculty and staff shed light on how the pandemic has exposed and widened disparities in enrollment and success among students, further disadvantaging those with already less resources and institutional knowledge, whether due to the digital divide, including a lack of technology and reliable Wi-Fi access, or due to increasing work and financial constraints, especially among essential workers or those with families at home, or due to the rising demand for academic and basic needs support, such as mental health counseling and tutoring services. Because these are the types of students that rely the most on the transfer pass, addressing their needs and concerns must inform all future policy efforts to increase enrollment. Doing so as quickly as possible will likely be necessary, given that statewide transfer enrollment has already declined at UC and CSU campuses. And more recently, the UC reported declines in both transfer applicants and admits for fall 2022, signaling a restriction in access to bachelor's degrees among the state's community college students. Now, while these trends in enrollment and persistence are concerning and should continue to lead the discussion on post-pandemic recovery, it's also important that I highlight our relatively promising finding that students who remained enrolled did relatively well despite the disruptions that they and their colleges faced. In our report, we also look closely at how the number of units attempted and earned changed during the pandemic, and find that the number of transferable units students earn actually did not change much in 2020 and 2021, even after controlling for various student level, demographics, and college factors. In this figure, we highlight the average number of units earned in the fall term from 2017 to 2021 among students with different levels of experience in community college, from first-time students to students with 3 years experience. And what we find is that the increase we see in unit accumulation prior to the pandemic, which is most visible here among first-time students, was mostly retained during the pandemic. And though not shown here, we also looked at GPA and similarly find small differences. And most of the difference we did find was actually positive, meaning GPAs were slightly higher during the pandemic, a likely result of changes in the student cohort, but also due to increased flexibilities in grading, which we found to be fairly common through our interviews with faculty. And again, in these and in actually all of our analysis, we attempt to control for changes in the student cohort by accounting for student demographics and college factors. So we're able to mostly account for the fact that students who remained enrolled were different than those that did not. But still, we know that these results should be taken with the caveat that those who remained enrolled probably faced less challenges as a result of the pandemic. And as we know from our interviews and from other great qualitative studies on this topic, the students who struggled to remain enrolled already faced much greater academic and non-academic challenges before the pandemic. Nevertheless, these trends are promising, and as we can see in this chart, a higher share of transfer intending students were able to make significant progress along the transfer path through the pandemic. This chart specifically looks at the share of first-time students completing what we have found in our previous research to be an important determinant of future transfer, which is the critical milestone of earning at least 30 transferable units and completing transfer level English and math within 1 year. And as you can see here, the share of students doing so has increased over time, likely a result of pre-pandemic reforms such as AB 705, which was implemented in fall 2019, and widened opportunities for students to access and succeed in trans-level coursework. Though we do not go into detail on AB 705 in this report, we have an extensive line of work in this area and have found in our most recent research that colleges have continued to effectively implement remedial education reforms through the pandemic. Most importantly, though, considering at least our interest today, is that the share of students completing this milestone also increased for fall 2019 and fall 2020 enrollees whose one-year outcomes were both affected by the pandemic. Though not shown here, we find that not just the share, but also the number of students doing this increased for all groups, which is remarkable given the large declines in enrollment and persistence we find during pandemic-affected terms. Still, I should note that while all groups experience increases, we can see here that equity gaps remain. Black and Latino students who are and were already more likely to not enroll or drop out and earn less units than their peers are still lagging behind. Accordingly, future reform must continue to address these equity gaps. Now, speaking of future reform, I'd like to just briefly end with a few policy recommendations we outline in the report, and of which I'm sure our esteemed panel would like to comment and provide their expert insight on. First, as I discussed earlier, addressing challenges with enrollment must be the priority. This should take many forms, including expanded high school outreach, dual enrollment and admissions programs, as well as deliberate outreach to adult learners and students who previously stopped out. At the same time, improving persistence and success among students already enrolled is critical. As I just showed, reforms such as AB 705 have widened opportunities for students to succeed in transfer-level courses, but more work is needed to close equity gaps and ensure all students have viable opportunities to make significant progress on the transfer path. The pandemic exposed the need for expanded holistic supports, while equity-minded reforms within classrooms may also be necessary to promote student success. And from a broader perspective, the state and its higher education systems must work together to retain and build from their progress towards widening transfer pathways. AB 928, which was recently passed, is a step in the right direction, ensuring continual collaboration among the community colleges, the CSU, and UC systems. And lastly, as we look towards the future of community colleges, it will be necessary to adapt course and support offerings to meet student needs and ensure they are not falling off the transfer path. This likely entails an expansion of online course and resource offerings, as well as expanded flexibilities, academic supports, and mental health counseling. And on this note, I'll do a shameless plug for the need for more research at the college and state level to better identify successful policies and initiatives, as well as prospective and current students who would benefit the most from supports, different modes of instruction, and non-academic resources. Now, that concludes the presentation portion of our event today. Just a reminder that we will now have a panel discussion, which will surely expand on everything I just talked about. But if you have any specific questions you'd like to ask for our audience Q&A portion of the session, please send them our way at ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and we'll attempt to get to them towards the end of our hour here. And with that, I'll now hand it off to my co-author and research fellow, Jacob Jackson, who will lead that discussion.
Thanks, Cesar, for your excellent presentation. I'm Jacob Jackson. I'm a research fellow at PPIC, and I'm very excited for today's discussion. We have a great panel to help us focus on what's next for community colleges as we recover from the pandemic. I'd like now to welcome our panelists. Their very impressive bios can be found on the PPIC event page, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to give a brief introduction. First, I'd like to welcome Nikki Edgecombe, a senior research scholar with the Community College Research Center. Next, I'd like to welcome Marvin Martinez, who's the Chancellor of Rancho Santiago Community College District. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Rebecca Rona Shaughnessy, Vice Chancellor for Educational Services and Support with California's Community Colleges. And ahead of time, I want to thank you so much for joining three experts here on the future of community colleges as we recover from the pandemic. So for our first question, I think it's critical to think about student needs while thinking about enrollment success. And the pandemic taught us a lot about student needs. From where you sit in your position, how have you seen student needs change since the pandemic? Or perhaps, how has the pandemic highlighted student needs that were already there? And I'll start with you, Nikki, if you're willing.
Sure. Great to be with you all today. I think, my first response, I think, is the pretty obvious one, which is the pandemic really revealed the range of housing, employment, childcare, other basic needs that students can struggle with, particularly students who are working in employment sectors that can experience economic dislocations and quickly in situations like pandemic. I think the other thing that I will frame, though, is we have for some time struggled with figuring out the best way to deliver online learning and online student services supports in ways that support academic success and take up of available student supports. I think that's a space where, on the one hand, I think colleges did amazing work innovating, training faculty, expanding offerings. Early data is still coming in, so we don't know exactly what this looks like, but it does look on the whole like we are seeing nationally some of the trends we saw, which are disparities in outcomes by things like race, gender, and income, and college first generation status persisting in some of those data. So hopefully we can dig in. The first part of the pandemic looked a little bit different than what it's looked like in 2022, but those are areas that I would certainly flag.
Wonderful. And Marvin, from your perspective as the chancellor of a college district in California, what have you seen about student needs? What has the pandemic revealed to you?
Thank you. Again, thank you for the invitation. I certainly want to be able to support what Nikki just stated, but also what the outreach, what the research that Cesar just talked about revealed. I think that, many of the students, specifically the students of color, basically came out of COVID, I would say, in worse shape than before. It certainly revealed that they needed to continue to improve their skills in math and English, and that needed to be improved even a lot more. It also revealed some of the areas that Nikki just mentioned. A lot of students are still not coming back because of issues of finance. They just don't have the resources, so that became even much more clear. Also, we talked about the digital divide. During COVID, many students, of course, had to rely on paying for their internet, getting top-notch laptops. That also certainly was revealed. Students who are low income. Many students who are low income obviously were studying from a two-bedroom apartment. And a two-bedroom apartment, as many students would tell us, is not a library. It's not a study hall. It's a two-bedroom apartment. And they did not do really well. So again, I think that we have a lot of work to do to continue to help and support our students so they can transition back to the campus. And one last thing, I know we're going to address this later on, in many of the surveys that we conducted of students, they also stated that they want to come back to the campus because of all the reasons that I just stated. They want to come back and have access to state-of-the-art libraries, state-of-the-art tutoring labs, state-of-the-art math labs, English labs. They need access to those resources. They need a better study environment. That certainly, of course, was revealed, and given the data that we're looking at, that makes a lot of sense even more today.
Thanks so much. And Rebecca, you sit in a unique position as the Vice Chancellor for Educational Services and Support. What has the pandemic taught you about student needs?
Well, all the things that Marvin and Nikki mentioned, but also I think on top of that, right, the pandemic and then the economic recession really has exacerbated a lot of the student needs. You think about the mental well-being piece for really everybody, right? And then also the financial stability piece, which we see results in increase in a lot of the basic needs and securities, so including food and housing and others. And more importantly, I think the pandemic is exposing the persistent inequities that vulnerable populations, especially people of color, have been experiencing in education, in employment, in housing, and healthcare. And when we think about, think about our students through the education lens, but really they are community members. So all these inequities that a human being experiences in where they live, our students are also experiencing, right, inside our campuses and also in the communities that they live. So that's why as community colleges, it's really imperative for us to really double down on equity and ensure that we address student needs, advance student outcomes, and support our system to recover in an equitable way.
Rebecca, that's great. And I'm going to actually stick with you because this next question leads right into it. So our research did show that the pandemic furthered inequities between students by race. What should colleges consider when reaching out and recruiting potential and returning students to increase enrollment, especially with an eye toward equity?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. As a system, I think we're really making a bold move. Enrollment is important, but it's also right about persistence and completion. If we dive into the data and understand what's happening to these students, especially students of color, as they enter our institutions and go through our institutions, and what happens after they leave, we really see this persistent gap, right, from the enrollment pipeline to really students stopping out across, in their educational journey, and then really the inequity continue to persist for them as they enter into the employment. So it really requires us to behave very differently as higher education institution. So how do we really support our students from really empower them to be learners, and how do we create a sense of unconditional belonging for students when they're on campus, and also really educate students with a lens towards career mobility? How do we prepare them for that future lifelong learning is something we really want to focus on. So there's no silver bullet, right? It really requires a comprehensive strategy to really towards enrollment persistence and completion. So when we think about that, and then also a critical piece when we talk about inequity is really using data, right? Students are telling us through surveys and others that money is the number one thing, college affordability. How do we address college affordability from a policy perspective, from a practice perspective, and think about also a big shift we're moving towards is really this shifting burden from students to institutions. So instead of having students performing poverty to receive the necessary support, how do we remove barriers so students, because we fully acknowledge that every human being, every student requires some fundamental financial stability to be able to thrive. And so how do we equip them with that so then they can be successful? And then how do we also, another thing we'll hear is, this greater flexibility between work and school, right? So think about, our student population, right? We have 74% of students who are part-time and non-credit, and many of them are working, right? So think about that, our student composition, how do we meet them where they are to create that flexibility? And along with that, dependent care, childcare, how do we support students so then they can come back? And then also, how do we make explicit and deliver the value proposition? Some of the things we hear from the students is they're questioning whether or not higher education in general and community colleges can bring that employment, a trajectory changing employment opportunity. So that really requires us to do the hard work, really thinking about how do we continue to double down on guided pathways, how do we continue to think about the continuity around mobility to really better support our students. So those are really, from a strategic perspective, we really need to think about, right? And then colleges have been doing that, and we continue to encourage colleges, right, to act with urgency. We have been blessed with robust investment into our system, and many of these investments are flexible. So how do we really think about what's the best way to provide direct aid to students, and then also have these dollars result in direct support for our students? And then act quickly and act bravely, and then we can continue to engage in a data-informed continuous improvement, right? When things don't work, then that's pivot and try something different. So that's kind of the process we continue to engage to support colleges.
You're speaking my language with data. I love it. Nikki, this is not a problem limited to California. And so what have you seen, and what should we be focusing on when we're thinking about community college enrollment going forward?
I think Rebecca really hit on sort of the range of understandings that institutions need to bring to the communities in their service areas. I think the biggest ones that, or among the larger ones that students are facing, are the economic trade-offs. How do I work? How do I go to college? And so I think it's critical that institutions, community colleges, understand what that looks like, and then thinks about structuring course offerings, student supports, other resources to enable students to be able to do both of those things. And then from a state policy or an affordability standpoint, we've certainly seen lots of states trying to invest in scholarship programs, and in some case living stipends, to support enrollment in programs that lead to high demand fields and family sustaining wages. So I think there's a broader conversation about how the institution can sit within this these economic considerations that students have to manage.
That's wonderful. And Marvin, you've actually seen some success in your district, and so maybe you can talk a little bit about your success in enrollment and increasing enrollment, and what lessons you have for other colleges.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I mean, so let me just state a couple facts first. One is, we're projecting that at the end of the fall semester, Santa Ana College, which is our flagship campus, will have increased enrollment by 28% over the last semester. 28%. Santiago County College, which is a smaller campus, but it's actually almost becoming a middle-sized campus, they're projecting their enrollment at the end of this semester to be close to 5%. So both campuses are doing good, and both campuses have a lot of success. So let me tell you how this happened. And I think Rebecca pointed a little bit to this. I think that the way you have to market to students today has to be a lot different than what we were doing back in 2017 or 18. So how has the world changed? Well, today, you could actually go work at McDonald's or In-N-Out Burger and make $21 an hour, $22 an hour. It used to be minimum wage. I'm sure all of us remember those days. So now for a lot of students, they're thinking short term. They're 17, 18 years old. They're thinking short term. Hey, I can go make some good money, flipping burgers or working for whomever. And, and so what we have to do today that's different than we had to do before is, how do we still become that first choice for students when they graduate from high school? How do we make that case to them? And we often utilize, very academic reasons for doing that, in the past, such as, well, you can get a good education and you'll do well. And, well, we have to mix that up. It can't be that can't just be the focus. And that's not how we're going to persuade students to come back. So students still tell us that the number one reason that they don't come back to school is because of financial reasons. That seems to be consistent with most of the research studies that I've seen. So how do we help them come back? So here's what we've done. Number one, we've increased our program as we work with high schools. We call that program dual enrollment. So the number of sections that we have increased has been dramatic. It's almost like 160, 170% increase in dual enrollment. Why is that good for a high school student? Number one, if we do a class for them at the high school level, it's free. They don't have to pay anything. So that helps them with their financial resources. Number one. Number two, we know that the research clearly indicates that if they are enrolled and do enrollment, they're going to do much better. And when they eventually go to college and start as juniors, or maybe start as sophomores or juniors, they're going to do really well when they eventually go to an institution of higher ed. So we know that dual enrollment works for financial reasons. It also helps students become more successful academically. So we have increased the number of offerings, not just with K through 12 public, K through 12 institutions, but also with private institutions, with charter schools. So that has dramatically increased, and it's given us a significant bump. Well, the other issue, as we talk about dual enrollment, retention dramatically improves for students who are in high school and who are taking our courses at the high school level. So that has done a lot for us. The other thing is, non-credit or adult education, continuing education, that's become another area for us where enrollment has just dramatically increased. So here's a population of students who, by the way, have always been there. We call them working adults. But prior to COVID-19, what are the offerings that we gave working adults? We had classes that would start at 9 o'clock in the morning for them, 10 o'clock, 11. Guess what? They were not enrolling because they were working. And so with remote instruction actually has been a benefit to them, because remote instruction has provided a viable way for them to be enrolled in the class and to be able to, do the class, after work and whenever they have time, or on the weekends, or after they put the kids to sleep and after dinner. So that's caused a dramatic really increase for us in our enrollment. Santa Ana College is projecting a 25% increase on top of last semester to their enrollment in non-credit and adult education.
Marvin, I'd actually like to stick on that because you mentioned online education. It's later on in the discussion, but let's do it now. Online education expanded a lot, and not everybody who you thought would take it up took it up, and some students really ended up liking it a lot. What's the future of online education at your campuses?
I think the future is really good for the adult working immigrant populations. They see remote instruction as viable for them because they are working. They're working all day long. We made certain assumptions that they couldn't handle the technology. Well, guess what? They can. And as I always like to say, if they can handle a cell phone and learn how to work an iPhone, they can handle remote instruction. It's a lot easier, I think, than learning how to use our phones. So it's been successful for them. We've developed a number of non-credit career pathway programs, CTE career pathway, and that's been a tremendous benefit for them. We're looking at developing high school online programs, because also there's a lot of high school students who want to take our courses, but they just don't have the time, but they would have time after school. And I think that'll be a program that will just grow tremendously. So we're looking forward to Santiago Canyon College moving forward in this direction. But, look, the bottom line with remote instruction in regards to services specifically for those 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and 20-year-olds, it hasn't been as good. They are the type of students who just need more support. We've tried remote counseling. We've tried remote tutoring. It has not been as successful. And our students, specifically students of color or students who are Latino, they want to be on a campus. They want to meet with a counselor or tutor face-to-face. So, again, just like anything else, right? It has some positives, it has some negatives. So certainly remote instruction has some positives, but also has some negatives. That's
very interesting. Nikki and Rebecca, from where you sit, how does remote instruction and online education kind of play into the future of community colleges?
I'll just flag in some other work that CCRC is doing in partnership with SRI, the post-secondary Teaching with Technology Collaborative. We've really learned about institutions nationwide who had shifted fully to online, trying to figure out where is that right balance point around online offerings versus face-to-face. And I think colleges are negotiating that right now. One of the things, though, that I think is important and reflects an opportunity out of the pandemic and the shift to online was the investment that colleges had to make in professional development to support faculty. We don't tend to have as coordinated an effort around instructional change in community colleges. And though this was oftentimes around the technology or around the deployment of the technology, one of the interesting opportunities it's opened up are conversations about teaching and learning, about curriculum, about pedagogy. And so I think if the field can continue to leverage some of those openings, I think that is actually a critically important student success component, because our community colleges are teaching institutions. And so investment in the teaching and learning environment has the potential to bolster the effects of things like co-requisite remediation and other reforms that have been implemented.
Really from, system level, we see this growth in online education just kind of came on steroids, right, during COVID. And I would say that's really the silver lining of this pandemic, to really demonstrate that we all can, right, to shift and to be nimble to meet students where they are. And distance education really shows a lot of promise. And I think where I really see this going is really creating that equitable flexibility for our students. So whatever works for the student, for the type of students, or for students, depending where their life circumstances is where we need to get to in terms of delivering something that's equitable, and that's sometimes a preferred option for students who want to pursue and continue their higher education journey. So I think a huge focus for our distance education is going to be around quality and equity. And accessibility, obviously, is another one. I'm constantly reminded that inconvenience for some often results in exclusion for our students with disabilities. So what does that look like for distance education is going to be a critical concern. And then, along the same line as what Nikki mentioned, professional development for our faculty and also support for our students to be productive in the online environment is going to be also critical. And another piece is around technology evaluation, right? Because we have a lot of now ed tech products. They're showing up to say, here are all the things that can support you with your distance education. And the promise is you just buy our tool, then it's online education, right? And so as a system, we're really thinking about this carefully to design criteria to make sure that these technology tools are, most importantly, have to be equitable, is built on equitable assumptions, right? And then also think about whether or not those are actually solving the problems we intend to address for our system. And also technology, whether or not that's compatible to, phones and compatible to Chromebooks, so we're not making assumptions about, the things that students have as we deliver our instructional services and support services in a way that benefits our students. And then the last bit is, how do we think about, obviously different colleges have different, because of local control, have different kind of preference and also decisions around, the distance education versus in person. But how do we leverage our 116 colleges? So we are a system strong, not just one college strong. So how do we leverage course exchange? So for students who can't find the right option for them at their home college, they're able to also find online options across our system. So how do we kind of really leverage the resources system-wide? Another piece that we're thinking about.
That's great.
Yeah, if I can make just a quick statement.
Of course.
Look, I think it's important that a direction continue to be provided to all the colleges in California. And that direction is that they need to come back fully face-to-face. They need to do it. There's still colleges, districts around the state that are not coming back. They're still maybe doing remote instruction 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and 2 days they're face-to-face. Again, our research continues to indicate that students want to come back. They are pleading to come back. I think we've had a lot of success here because from the day the governor closed us down, I remember that day back in early March of 2020, the plan has always been to come back. And as a result, we came back sooner. And because we came back sooner, we had, to me, an advantage to be able to work and improve our enrollment strategies. Many college districts didn't come back until a year after we opened up. And I think that our board of trustees, just like all board of trustees, were lobbied left and right to maybe not open up as much or to stay remote as much as possible. I believe we were successful because our board never wavered. Our board stood firm and said, we're coming back. So again, research may not be able to indicate that, but I think that I think to me, a direction that has to be provided is that we need to come back. This is not remote instruction. Clearly, the research clearly indicates has not been good for people of color. So I'm not sure what we're waiting for. I really don't know what we're waiting for. So I think, again, a direction that has to be provided at the statewide level is for us to come back.
Thanks so much. So I do want to take this just a second to remind the audience that we'll begin audience Q&A in about 5 minutes. So just a reminder, you can submit your questions to PPIC event questions @gmail.com. Please include your name and organization along with the question if you're willing. Thanks so much. And then PPIC is all about bright spots. And one of the bright spots we noticed is that students who did stay enrolled at community colleges did relatively well. And a lot of that was due to the perseverance of students in the face of the pandemic impacting their health, their families, their communities. So it's pretty impressive. What are some strategies that colleges employed during the pandemic to help students succeed? And what are some other strategies that should stick around, even if as the pandemic kind of wanes? And Nikki, I know this is perhaps unique to California, but perhaps not. What are some strategies you've seen colleges employing that have paid dividends for students?
Well, I do think the investment in faculty learning, professional learning, has been a critical part of supporting the success of the students who did manage to weather the storm and stay enrolled. Now, there are compositional effects around that group of students who were able to stay enrolled, but I do think we've learned quite a bit about how to amp up the level of support, how to work on strengthening course structure and guidance, how to support the implementation of a holistic supports that don't simply look like a traditional advising model, but may include a range of mental health basic needs, other financial supports for students in their times of need. So what I see colleges doing is figuring out what that needs to look like moving forward, and particularly trying to figure out what it looks like financially for their institution once federal relief funds run out. So I think there's a lot of strategic thinking now about, we know this is going to help our students, this is going to help us keep students enrolled. How do we build this into our base budgets and into our normal operations?
Excellent. Rebecca, what about from your position as Vice Chancellor for Educational Services and Support?
Yes, to what everything what Nikki is saying. Also, for our system, we have seen a really intentional and robust investment in basic needs, right? Really being able to support students around things that we call at a system level the social determinants of educational success, right? And we have built a framework around that to really support the sustainability, right? And the structure and facilitate structural changes as a result of that. So a lot of times when we have basic needs centers, we will have dollars, and if the dollars are solely dedicated to crisis response, then it's not necessarily a sustainable effort, right? So how do we think about shifting the programs and pilots to an ecosystem and think about upstream? So when we are serving the students with who's experiencing homelessness, in addition to housing solutions, we're thinking about financial aid, we're thinking about what categorical programs, how they should behave differently to then support students' financial stability as a whole, right? So as a system, through that framework, we are saying financial stability, health and mental well-being, as well as the support networks, which is also a critical one to support career mobility, for example. these are the three core areas we want to dedicate our strategy around. So when we're thinking about an issue through kind of the social determinants lens, we understand we need to have a comprehensive solution set. Then we're bringing various institutional structures into this conversation. So it's no longer just a one program, one funding source conversation. It's really around how should the structure be shifted and how our regulations should be changed to create those enabling conditions to drive for those long-term changes.
Wonderful. And Marvin, you've seen enrollment success and persistence and course success at your campuses. Can you tell us some of the strategies you use and strategies that are sticking around even after the pandemic is ending?
Sure. By the way, really good question. So one of the holy grails in our institutions are, how do we help part-time students become full-time students? And in most campuses, 70 to 80% of our students are part-time, and only 20, maybe 30% are full-time. So in many ways, the students are there, right? So how do you help those part-time students become full-time students? So during the pandemic, we had a chance to come up with a program where we used HERF funds, and we call the program Cash for Credit. So what that is basically we offer an opportunity for students to be able to take more classes, and we would pay for those classes and give them cash. We come up with a plan where we would pay $50 per unit. And if they take a 3-unit class, that's $150. Or if they take another class, that's another amount of money that they would be receiving. Thus far, 7,000 plus students have taken advantage of this program. Thus far, we're seeing those students that were taking 1 class or 2 classes now are taking 3 or 4, as compared to the students who are not part of this program, who are still stuck taking 1 class or 2. Look, the research has been clear for years that if you only take 1 class per semester, the probability that you're going to graduate from one of the colleges is probably slim and none. I mean, the research has been there for a long time. So the key has always continues to be, how do we help students take more classes? And a lot of, and it's not that they don't want to. And they tell us, I would if you can help me with my finances. I mean, they have told us also that for years. So this program in many ways helps the students. It gives them the resources. We also have developed other programs as described by Rebecca to supplement that, from meeting their basic needs, or a lot of them don't have food, they don't need more than 1 meal per day. So we're helping them with their basic needs. But really the core of this has to be, how do we help students with their finances so they can take more classes? One last thing about all this, because students are taking more classes, guess what? We're being more efficient than ever before. So in other words, what that means is that in order to generate a certain number of FTEs, we don't need as many sections or as many classes, because more students are taking more classes. So, when the HERF funds run out, as Nikki pointed out, the funds will run out. We're looking at our foundations. We're looking at donors or in any way that we can find those dollars to continue to help students. But look, students, again, I'm not going to just come to the campus because they need food. They're going to come to the campus because they need a class. And if we can help them out with food and money, they'll stay and they'll finish and they'll graduate.
Thanks so much. And we're going to move on to the question and answers from the audience. And I'm glad you brought up HERF funds. One of the questions is right in line with that. So an audience member asks, many colleges provided laptops and MiFi devices during the pandemic to support student online coursework. How can community colleges continue to support technological and bandwidth needs as online learning becomes a larger part of the community college experience, especially as you consider HERF funds are going to sunset? And anybody want to answer that, you can speak up.
I could respond to some of it. Well, obviously, the colleges will need to reallocate monies from their budget to support this effort. Can some of it also come from their foundations or other fundraising that they may want to do? Yeah, but I think it's a commitment that the college has to make. And, the way they make that commitment is by reallocating some of those funds in order to help those students who feel that the way they can continue with school is by being enrolled remotely. So we need to find those dollars. They're there, by the way. And I know that. So we just need to figure out a way to reallocate them.
I have another question here. Some students whom I used to work with would choose to go to for-profit private schools that offered the same or a lesser degree, but had very slick marketing, offered less support, and the students incurred more debt. How do we attract these students back to a community college setting? And Nikki, this is not a problem unique to California. Any thoughts on that?
Interestingly, I was just reading about some of the marketing strategies for some of the for-profit colleges. And what they do is they expend the resources and increase the intensity of the touch early on. And so that is generally what gets students into that context. And as the data bear out, the outcomes aren't always particularly successful. That said, there is something I think we can learn about that intensity. How quickly from application will a student hear from somebody at the college? For the for-profits, that can happen within minutes. So we understand that there are limitations and there's constraints, but I do think the community college sector, the public sector, has to think about ways to enhance and intensify the recruiting activities that happen to ensure that an application or even an inquiry translates into application, acceptance, and enrollment.
Rebecca or Marvin, any thoughts on that?
I would just add to that. I mean, that's exactly what we're looking at, right? In that intensity that Nikki just described, user experience is key, right? They clearly removed a lot of the user barrier to entry, right? For potentially predatory purpose, but still, right? The practice itself is a helpful one for us to think about. Like, what does equity look like, and how do we reach out to students and meeting them where they are, remove these barrier and friction points? That's going to be critical, right? And then another piece is, we serve 1.8 million students, right, every year. So we think about that, our students live in our communities. So their experience through word of mouth is also very powerful. So the more we double down on our efforts in equitable transfer, in persistence and completion, these outcomes will also permeate, right? So that's also the kind of the both. And we have to really focus on enrollment, looking at customized strategies based on data, but also really focus on the persistence and completion strategies we have in place.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jacob, I think one of the major reasons we've had a lot of success in increasing our enrollment is that when you look at this from a 50,000-foot view, we changed the way we do business now internally and the way we do business now externally. I would love to tell you that we've been able to increase our enrollment because we put a nice bus ad out there and we have a nice radio ad, and that resulted in all kinds of students coming to us. No, so internally we've done a lot. Number one, we've improved our customer service. Think about that for a second. Customer service, that means that we're nice to students and we help them out and we return their phone calls, and when they call us, we don't wait 2 months to get back to them. We call them back as soon as we can. Some of those phone calls, by the way, are made by other students. So we employ students and they call their fellow students, which we used to call that peer mentoring or peer counseling when all of us went to college. And it works. It's very effective. They call their fellow students and they are able to help them with a lot of their needs. So we've also moved up our timelines for enrollment. Anyway, there's a lot of work that we've done internally. Externally, we've improved our relationships with K-12. We've improved our relationships with business and industry. We've improved our relationships with our four-year partners. And obviously, I mentioned already how much we've increased our enrollment, not only with K-12 and charter schools and so forth, but also we've increased our enrollment with a number of for-profit organizations. We have this huge program with this supermarket called Northgate here in Orange County, and we do a lot of their training. And they pay us to do the training, or sometimes we told them, no, don't worry about it, we'll get reimbursed through FTS. So again, there is no magical approach. All of us, I think, as community college leaders, have to take a look at internal practices and approaches and methodologies, as well as our external ones. And that's what has to change. but we're not going to increase enrollment just because we have a nice radio ad out there. It's not going to happen.
This is, you just touched on this, and this is a great question from Jeremiah Rhodes, who's a first year's master's student at UC Berkeley. Is there a plan being considered or implemented aimed at reaching students that had to withdraw because they couldn't continue remote instruction due to internet access or financial hardships or family issues? And are there any plans or initiatives aimed at providing them with pathways to re-enrollment? Rebecca, from where you sit, Chancellor's office, is there anything system-wide?
And I think that's part of the process we have that's baked into our enrollment strategy, right? So when we are looking at so the most recent survey says, half the students who we survey really want us to reach out back to them to talk to them about enrolling in college. Those are the students, either prospective students or students who are thinking about re-enrolling, right? So students want that kind of outreach from our institutions. And what we encourage institutions, again, is to look at the data and really talk to the students, understanding what those barriers are, right? And then leverage resources to do so. So I think some of those barriers that Jeremiah mentioned here are definitely on our radar, right? So as we think about how to leverage our institutional funding, like what Marvin mentioned, to support these students, that's definitely at the core of what we plan to do.
Marvin and Nikki, any thoughts on those?
You want to go ahead, Nikki?
I'll just note that one of the few bright spots in some of the National Student Clearinghouse reports of late is that there's been growth in the some college, no degree population, in large part because of precisely what Jeremiah is asking about. That becomes a pool, right? That becomes a group of students who had the intention of going to college and completing something. And so they represent an opportunity as colleges rethink all of these various enrollment strategies we've been discussing today. So, in a large way, there's still, with shrinking K-12 graduations, there's still a robust pool of potential community college students that we need to focus on and reach.
Yeah. Thank you for that bright spot. What about you, Marvin?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd like to add is that the way that we market also had to change. As you know, most of our marketing focuses for many, many years have been on those 18-year-olds who are graduating from high school. Well, we have to expand that. We have to expand to those students that Jeremiah just described. If a student finished from high school and they've been out of school for a year or two, they don't see themselves as a 18-year-old anymore. They see themselves as an adult. So how do we market to them? How do we bring them back to the campus? So we do have a number of events that the campuses have where they host the students for them to come back. Remote instruction many times works well with them as well. The other thing that in regards to marketing, a lot of them are also looking for jobs. They're looking to come to our campuses, learn a skill so they can go out and help their families. So again, we have to reshift and refocus how we market. It's not just the 18-year-olds, it has to be everyone else. And just one last thing, we noticed with our enrollment this semester, nearly 20%, almost 25% of our students are adult ed, continuing education students. I mean, I remember the days where 90% were students who were high school students. Well, that's no longer the case. It's more like 80%. I think in many campuses, probably more like 70%. So we have to change our focus and rethink how we market.
Love it. So I really want to thank everybody here for the great discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thanks to Cesar for the excellent presentation. Thanks to all the PPIC staff who made this event possible. Thanks to our funders. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. So if you pre-registered for the event, later today, you'll receive a survey from PPIC. We'd love if you could take a couple minutes to respond. Let us know how we did. And just want to say thanks again and have a wonderful afternoon.